Namaste.
Namaste.
So I have visual aids today. Hardly ever have visual aids, so don't develop expectations. I wanted to talk about Omnism. This idea that, in Buddhist parlance, religion is a finger pointing at the moon. It isn't the moon. Or in this case, religion is a finger pointing at the transcendent. And with these readings, there were, no reading is perfect. I don't think anybody thinks a reading is perfect unless they write it. But I wanted to point out that John Maransky, when he talks about, it's on the second page near the end of that first paragraph, he talks about the mystical, universally inclusive views of ongoing Buddhist revelation that stand in tension with the paradigm of scholastic criticism of non-Buddhists. It's that classic thing between the mystics and the theologians, or the thinkers and the feelers.
The hierarchy.
Yeah, the feelers get along with everybody. Those who have a direct experience of transcendence recognize that even if somebody's from another tradition, they've had the same experience. Whereas the people who sit down to define that, they get paid to argue about that. And the other thing was that in that second reading, when he says prophetic religion is severe, militant, uncompromising, I don't think that's the best word. I think he probably meant cognitive religion, doctrine, dogma. It's rigid. And I would hasten to point out that Roman Catholicism is not the only religion that's produced tyrants. So we need a little napkin. Attila the Hun. Okay, let's suppose that we decide that the best definition of God is a banana. And we know this is a banana because it's yellow.
It's got the right shape.
It's got the right shape. It's got this little thing here where it hangs from the bunch. It's got the little banana button that I didn't learn about until I was in my 50s. That's how you open a banana.
I didn't know that either.
No, all this time, I was doing one of these jobs. And so we set about describing God. We said God's yellow. God has a button. Little thing at the top. God grows in bunches. And if you want to know about God, you need to know about bananas. Okay? Now, along comes Boris, who spent his whole life living on the Siberian tundra, never seen a banana. He says, oh, God is green. Because these are the bananas I see. It's the first one I saw when I came off the tundra. And the guy who picks them, because they pick them when they're green, says, you're right. God is green. I don't know who you are to think that this yellow thing here is God. Because God is clearly this thing. And then they come across somebody who knows about the banana button. He says, no, this is God. They said that can't be God because it doesn't have the little banana button on the bottom and there's not the thing on the top. You're wrong. Then, we come across a guy who lives in the desert. He says, oh, this is God. This is what a banana looks like. I don't know what those things you have, this green thing, much less this thing that doesn't even have a skin, or the yellow one that did, are talking about. This is God. And then somebody really clever, I can't resist this, comes along and says, in the words of the old Anglican hymn, God in three pieces. blessed Trinity. Oh
Oh,
boy.
there we go.
Oh, somebody just rolled off the table.
That was the Christ that sacrificed for us.
So, I think this is a pretty good metaphor for the problem. We can explain all we want, and yet each of us carries a collection of preconceived notions, experiences, cultural expectations. In fact, to give you some idea of cultural expectations, Erin, my wife, was listening to her voicemails this morning or last night, and I was in the room so I could hear them. And so this is the work voicemails. And somebody said something about, that guy said he was going to call me back in a couple minutes. And after an hour and a half, I just called him back. And he said, I told you I was going to call you back in a couple minutes. In some cultures, people say, I'm going to call you back in a couple minutes, and it could be days. In other cultures, they expect to call in a couple minutes. And when the person who's looking for the call in a couple minutes doesn't get it, and calls the person back who, in their mind, said, I'll call you back sooner or later once I know, now there's conflict. Same thing's true in religions. So, what's the problem? Well, the real problem I inadvertently displayed when the Christ rolled off the table. We get attached to our metaphors. We get attached to the images we construct to try and explain something that ultimately transcends language's ability to explain. And so somebody says, well, for example, St. Paul, it's no longer Christ who lived, or it's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. Did he eat a lot of bananas? Is that how that happened? And while that seems silly on one level, it really isn't so silly, because we sit there and think, how in the world did that work? Somebody crawl inside? And so, if we in the West can learn something from the East, it's this notion of holding things loosely. If we hold them too tightly, then the thing becomes for us a substitute for what it represents. So much so that we lose sight of what it represents. And we've probably all been a part of a group of some kind that has done that. Sometimes a certain ritual becomes so important that it's the most important thing. And if it changes, the end of the world is here. Sometimes we get attached to a certain style of music. And if the music changes, I once was asked to preach at a friend's church, and I said, this was out east, and I said, the reason that John wanted me to preach here today is to tell you that starting next week, there's going to be a new hymnal. And the faces. I mean, it was like, oh, what? And then even when I told them that I was just kidding, because I wanted to make a point about change, they didn't trust me anymore. You're the one.
Wow.
So, how can we avoid, as much as humanly possible, grabbing onto the wrong things and holding them? I think one of the ways is we remember why we're here. And we learn to distinguish between sort of human instinctual responses and what we hope are higher responses that we want to work toward. For example, nobody ever convinced anybody of anything post-mortem. And so it's probably a bad idea to go to war to convince people to believe what you believe. Ultimately, nobody who is hungry really cares about much else than finding something to eat. And so between those two places, this place of belief and this place of physical need, is a huge ground, a huge territory. And it doesn't have to come to where we're going to try and deprive somebody else of those things that we would not want to be deprived of. Life, basic needs, the right to participate, the right to grow, based on what is, after all, a matter of choosing. I suppose some would even argue this was once part of God, so now it's God in its entirety, because God's a hologram. We're arguing over bananas. Ultimately, I think the value has to be that human beings have intrinsic value. And it doesn't matter what you believe. It doesn't matter how you express it. It doesn't matter how it is you celebrate whatever it is you believe. The commonality is that, with the exception of the sickest of the sick, we are all trying to do our best. And rather than worship structures, might we learn to be open to truth wherever we find it? And when somebody says, that can't be a banana because you found it in the wrong place, it starts to sound pretty silly. Then we don't have to fight. Then we don't have to sit down with somebody and start sharing and look at them and try and decide what it is that they have wrong. But rather we can look at them for what we share in common. And we don't have to look around too much in our cities, our towns, our states, our nation, to find people who struggle to make that shift. And there's a good reason that struggle is there. I mean, when you're a cave person and a tiger comes up, you had to be able to say, that's a tiger, that's not a person, I shouldn't really leave the cave. But we're not cave people anymore. And the more we can reach out and transcend those differences, the more we can stop worshiping our containers and start looking at the contents, the sooner it is things will begin to turn around.